Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI.
An historic first, a former jihadist turned head of state visited the White House on Monday. Syrian interim president Ahmed al-Sharaa met with President Donald Trump in the Oval Office and announced that his country was joining the global coalition to defeat ISIS. At the same time, he implored the U.S. Congress to finally repeal the 2019 Caesar Act sanctions to help Syria recover, rebuild, and revive its post-war economy. What is the situation like on the ground in Syria today? What direction is Shara's government taking the country? And what role can the United States play in helping Syrians seize their unprecedented but fleeting opportunity to reestablish their country as a strategic crossroads of the Middle East?
To help us tackle these questions and more, we've invited onto the podcast this week someone who just recently returned from Damascus, MEI Senior Fellow Charles Lister. Charles focuses on Syria, terrorism, and insurgency across the Levant, and he heads up MEI's Syria initiative. He's also the founder of the newsletter Syria Weekly.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please do check out MEI's other podcasts as well, Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis, and Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Gunul Toll.
Charles, it's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you.
So as we mentioned at the top, you were just in Syria as part of an MEI delegation. What were some of your key takeaways from that trip?
First takeaway is it's a lot easier to go by myself than bringing a big group, but
No doubt.
But I have to say, I mean, in all seriousness, it was quite enlightening to bring a group of people who are all very studied and worldly and familiar with so much of the world, but less familiar, frankly, with Syria, which has been such a closed place for such a long time. And it was really enlightening to bring a group of people who, many of whom by their own admission, had a kind of preconceived idea for what they were expecting to see, none of which ended up being true, and quite emotional even at times for them, being awoken to the reality of Syria's rich cultural and religious diversity. You know, we visited synagogues, churches, mosques, and heard stories about how synagogues, for example, have been looked after by the local Muslim community for many, many years and continue to hold thousands of years old scrolls and history and have been cared for by locals. And so it was really amazing to see, you know, a country that I'm very familiar with, and knew not to have those same preconceived ideas, but to watch people sort of learning and seeing with their own eyes that the reality is so much more different than what they had expected, frankly, from reading media and listening to lots of other sources over the years. So that was really amazing. Syria itself, from my perspective, has continued to settle down in terms of the transition. The government has really found its feet. The technocratic ministers, all of whom, you know, are bringing their own wealth of real professional experience in their own respective areas, have gone from, you know, 3 months ago trying to find their feet, trying to figure out what their strategic plans are, to actually starting to implement some of those plans. So, you know, we heard, for example, you know, huge projects in terms of 3, 4, and 5G connectivity, laying new submarine telecommunications cables to link Syria into Europe and then into Asia. You know, so on that basis alone, seeing things starting to move forward was amazing. But then at the same time, all of the bigger macro challenges continue to exist. There is still conflict ongoing in different corners of the country. Still 30% of Syria is not integrated into the rest of the state. You know, tensions and difficulties with Israel persist. And the biggest message we took away was that whilst Syria has received a huge amount of interest in large-scale foreign direct investment, the practical reality is it's still almost impossible to actually accomplish that with the Caesar Act still in place. So the biggest message that was just knocked over our heads in every single meeting we had was, please, we beg of you, the Caesar Act has to go if Syria has any chance of actual recovery.
Yeah, we'll come back to the Caesar Act in just a moment. But before we do, what is the situation like on the ground? I mean, what is the mood like among ordinary Syrians?
It used to be cautious. Now I think Syrians have accepted that this is the transitional government that is in place. It's not going away anytime soon, especially considering how much recognition and engagement it's received from the international community. So that's sort of settled. But I think there still continues to be a gap in terms of expectations from the way that the government has messaged its foreign policy achievements, which really are real and in many ways almost miraculous. The fact that in 11 months, this transitional government has been accepted in the way that it has really is almost a miracle. And the fact that they have sealed contracts worth more than $20 billion is an enormous achievement, considering, only a few months ago, massive range of sanctions was still in place. But the government has used this buzzword of development and recovery as a way to try to message to the population that this is our number one objective. And we are making progress in that area, sealing contracts for the construction of 5 huge power stations, 4 massive solar arrays across the country. So trying to suggest that, your electricity problems are all going to start recovering soon. Water is now the next big subject, the availability of drinking water. So the government's been celebrating its successes. The reality is that until very, very recently, even just the last few days, frankly, Syrians were not feeling any of the effects of those achievements. And I think the government in Damascus is still struggling to explain and to have the people understand and accept that it takes a really long time for this kind of recovery to materialize after so much destruction, so much corruption and mismanagement. And so I still think that's its biggest challenge. Although, like, the good news that's come out and just in the last few days is that thanks to a surge in gas supplies coming in via the north, in particular, Aleppo, for example, just had a couple of days ago 24 hours of electricity in one day, which has never happened in decades in Syria. And Damascus at one point went up to nearly 20 hours in one day. And this is, again, almost a miraculous development. So we are starting to see some of those improvements. But, heading into winter, access to fuel and everything else is going to be a big challenge. The government has just announced 20% cut in the price of all fuel and cooking gas as well, which will help to assuage some of the popular concerns. But again, having this as a strategic permanent shift is still going to take quite a lot of time.
Yeah, just kind of illustrates what we know about countries in transition, that there's both a immediate change, but also this very long running process, whether it's from, a communist to a democratic system or, coming out of a dictatorship. It's very kind of dichotomous role of change. You met with a number of high-level officials in Syria. What were some of your impressions of these individuals? Of course, it's a mix, but who are they, and how did you find dealing with them?
Yeah, well, I mean, Syria's government makeup, cabinet makeup, has changed a lot over the last 11 months. And just to sort of remind listeners, for the first roughly 2 months or so of the transition, what they called the caretaker government was entirely HTS, entirely members of the former armed group that came out of Idlib. Following that, the formation of the transitional government in March, 24 cabinet members, 3 of them were former members of HTS. So we saw a dramatic widening in terms of who held ministries. Now, the so-called sovereign ministries, foreign affairs, interior, and defense, are still controlled by HTS formers. But all of the rest of them are genuinely run by professional technocrats with huge experience in their respective files. I can't run through all of them, but people who have spent 20 years at Ernst & Young working all around the world, from Asia to America, people with long-standing careers in the financial system in the United States, are all running these ministries, and they're all really impressive. And again, I knew all of these people before, so I knew who they are and I know what to expect. But bringing an MEI delegation, one of the sort of unifying messages that came out of the group was they were astounded at the level of professionalism and experience that these ministers had, and quite inspired by a lot of their strategies and their visions. And so certainly for outsiders like that, they were genuinely blown away by, these aren't, I think some of them frankly expected to have, bearded jihadists running the transport ministry. But no, it's someone who's run transport businesses around the world for the last several decades, for example. That's the reality that we're in. One of the, perhaps for outside observers, surprising things that have come out of this transition is that right from the top, from President al-Sharaa down, the overwhelming emphasis or priority for them is sealing and building a relationship with the United States. So yes, they want to balance with Russia, they want to be open to China, they want to have relations with Europe and everywhere else, but from every ministry that we saw, every cabinet minister we met, and this wasn't just because we were coming from the US. I mean, it really is genuine. The United States is their number one priority. And having President al-Sharaa visit Washington has really sealed that deal. The fact that, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, this government has decided to join the counter-ISIS coalition is not an inconsequential decision internally. Not about the government, frankly, but about the street. And so they are, putting their cards where their mouth is, so to speak, to show that really the United States is their priority. And we certainly heard that loud and clear in terms of technology relationships with Meta and Facebook and Twitter and all of these major big tech companies. AI companies are engaging with the government now in all different sectors. So there's a lot of space there to be built, from oil and gas to technology and therein.
As you alluded to, Charles, President Shara was in town this week to meet with President Trump. What came out of their Oval Office meeting on Monday?
So it was interesting. It was a closed meeting, which is unusual for Trump. Sometimes he has planned closed meetings and then ambushed them with the media. So I think that on the one side, it showed that this remains, to an extent, a sensitive issue within some of Donald Trump's base. And we've seen that play out in the last few days on social media in particular. I think it also goes to show that some of their conversations were by necessity sensitive and not the kind of conversations you have in front of the media. There's also some sensitivity on the Syrian side, which I don't think gets enough acknowledgement. We are in this weird position where, yes, a former one-time al-Qaeda commander is now the president of Syria's transitional government. He's way more pragmatic and determined to work with America than the population of Syria is. And he is very aware of that. I think a lot of analysis these days makes a big deal, rightly so, of concerns within some of Shara's base. And that's real, but Shara's base will follow Shara. The population remains still highly suspicious of American motives. And very often, frankly, connects America with Israel. And so anything Israel does in the region, whether it's Gaza or in Syria today, is seen as part of some kind of an American-Israeli plot. Now, when it comes to Syria, frankly speaking, the Trump administration and Israel are talking two very different languages. So, but that's not a message or a reality that is understood on the street in Syria. So the fact that President Shara was here and the meeting was closed, I think had probably just as much to do with Syrian delicacies or fragility than it does with the American side. Likewise, the fact that the decision to join the counter-ISIS coalition, there was no official announcement of that from the Syrian side, because that's highly sensitive as well, and not just again about Shara's base, but also the population. So ironically, it was the State Department that announced it in a video, but there was no big formal, Rose Garden announcement or anything like that. So again, it still speaks to the reality that this opportunity in Syria is massive, hence the Oval Office meeting and all of the work that went on to secure that. But that both sides are very well aware of just how fragile the situation is, and so as not to blow this up in a way that could potentially hurt more than benefit.
Just following up on that, did the meeting accomplish everything Damascus was hoping it would?
I mean, I think in an ideal world, there was a hope that that at least following the meeting, there would have been an announcement from the House that the Caesar Act would have been repealed, and we didn't get that. There was, by chance, a meeting between the key holdout there, Representative Brian Mast, and President al-Sharaa the night before the Oval Office meeting, and everything I have heard is it was cordial, guarded, but cordial. Representative Mast issued a statement afterwards and made no mention of sanctions, which was taken as a discouraging sign. So I gather there's still some work to be done to make sure that repeal goes through. But certainly sanctions was the number one goal that the Syrian delegation had. And they did get the UN sanctions removed, which then resulted in the delisting of Shara and Anas Khattab, the interior minister, here in the UK, soon in the EU. Japan just announced that they were removing them too. So that was helpful, especially on the UN side. But they haven't got the Caesar Act fixed yet. And really, there's no understating how central that is to determining whether or not this recovery in Syria works or not. And if there's no repeal in the next few days, or certainly by the end of this year, there won't be for another 12 months. There's almost no way that will happen, because this is an act of Congress and not something the White House can control. So the clock's ticking on that. And no, they haven't yet at least achieved what they needed to from that.
What do you think this kind of high-profile Oval Office visit tells us about the broader state of U.S.-Syria relations? And how do you think Washington and Damascus can build on the momentum established here to further strengthen and deepen their ties to kind of make the most of these post-Assad opportunities?
Well, I think it shows one what I said a few minutes ago, which is that on the Syrian side, they are overwhelmingly, determined to head towards a major relationship with the US, which really defines their international relations, and so that's clear. And I think from their perspective, been achieved by the visit. On the US side, it shows that the Trump administration has really taken a bold leap forward in terms of making the decision to engage and then back and support. And there is a lot that the Trump administration is doing behind the scenes, especially in the business world, facilitating major meetings and potential investments with some of America's biggest companies in Syria, from Uber to Chevron and ConocoPhillips and everyone in between. There's a lot of movement behind the scenes that the White House has facilitated and pushed forward. And on the security level, given the fact that from the US side, one of the core goals that the government had here was to announce the counter-ISIS coalition thing. I mean, that is, within 11 months, the most stunning kind of reversal of dynamic from where we were before. First of all, the idea that any Syrian government would join the counter-ISIS coalition was almost a fantasy, considering the government that existed before. But the fact that a government run by Ahmed al-Sharaa has joined the counter-ISIS coalition is kind of extraordinary. And I can't, reveal loads of specifics, but what I have heard recently from some of the most senior US military and intelligence officials about the way that the US-Syria relationship is shaping up on the security front is kind of blows my mind.
Based on what factors? I mean, in what way?
Based on intelligence sharing, security cooperation, joint raids, both against ISIS, but more importantly, which has received no attention, also against Iran's interests in Syria and surrounding areas. One of the things I learned recently was that the US-Syria security relationship started to take shape in May and was based on a test. The US intelligence provided a whole bunch of intelligence around assets that Iran had established in eastern Syria, tunnels, warehouses, massive caches of strategic weaponry, all controlled by a very powerful tribe that had basically been the IRGC's key partner in eastern Syria. And this intelligence was provided to the Syrian Interior Ministry, and about 24 hours later, the entire complex was raided, controlled, taken over, the entire tribal leadership was arrested, and the US was totally blown away. And very, very quickly after that, we started to see an institutional relationship established. So there's been at least half a dozen major raids against ISIS together between US Special Forces and Syrian forces, including taking out the most senior ISIS leader in Syria. And that built a lot of confidence. And now there's almost a semi-permanent US intel and military presence in Damascus, albeit covert. And they have both impressed each other with their capabilities and their results. And so, they're riding high on a wave of confidence at the moment, which, certainly nobody would have expected, and certainly not this quickly. But that's the reality on the ground at the moment.
So we've spoken a bit about Syria officially joining the global coalition to defeat ISIS. First of all, how large of a threat, how serious of a threat is ISIS in Syria today?
When you look at the data of what it's up to, it's diminished from where we were in 2024. 2024, all the red alarm bells were ringing about how far and wide and intensively ISIS was operating. So clearly the fall of Assad's regime was a big shock to the ISIS system. Because for a long time, the fact that Assad was going nowhere and was tearing the country apart and what have you was ISIS's greatest recruitment tool. ISIS has clearly adapted, and it's running a two-track campaign or two-track strategy now. One, running a conventional insurgency inside SDF-held northeastern Syria. So my data, at least, says 89% of ISIS attacks this year have been in SDF areas. So running a persistent insurgency, not at the same level of intensity as we saw in 2024, but increasing month on month. So recovering, in other words. The other track is probably more dangerous, which is more of a terrorist campaign or an attempted terrorist campaign inside government-held areas of Syria. And so at my count, through my insider sources in the Syrian government, 13 major plots have been foiled in the last 10 months. Plots to target churches, Shia shrines, busloads of returning refugees. One suicide bomb plot that would have sought to hit an Israeli patrol in occupied areas of Syria. A lot of those plots were foiled thanks to US intelligence sharing with Syria. So the prospect of that campaign actually beginning to be successful, we've only really had one ISIS attack that broke through, which was a bombing of a church in outer Damascus, which was, a horrendous attack, but only one out of 14 that I'm aware of. So far, the success rate in terms of intercepting these plots has been encouraging. But if it wasn't, we'd be in a very, very worrying place in Syria. I mean, the weakest, most fragile point in Syria right now is minorities. And when you start to see, or if we start to see, more churches or Shia shrines or anything else being attacked, we should begin to get much more worried about the stability of the country. So thankfully, most of it has been stopped, but ISIS's determination to persist is clearly still there. And I point out in the last few days, in the, clearly timed to coincide with President Shara's visit, the Syrian Ministry of Interior launched near nationwide raids in almost every governorate of the country against ISIS cells and arrested nearly 100 ISIS operatives. And the last thing I'll say on that is these raids were all urban raids. They were all in cities and towns. This is not the ISIS that we've grown used to over the last 5, 6, 7 years in Syria, where they've been entirely desert-based and then go into urban areas every now and then to try and launch an attack. The group's turned more urban recently, which is where it is most dangerous.
One of the obstacles to the anti-ISIS coalition in the past has been kind of this territorial division in Syria between government-controlled versus Syrian Democratic Forces or SDF-controlled areas. This is not obviously the only reason why Damascus wants SDF military units to be integrated into the regular Syrian army, but especially now that it's part of this anti-ISIS coalition, it's an added benefit. On Monday, we saw that there was a Syrian, Turkish, and U.S. high-level trilateral meeting where one of the main issues of discussion was, in fact, this integration of SDF units into the regular Syrian army. They all sides agreed that they are pushing forward with a plan to make that happen. Who was not represented there was anyone from SDF. Mm-hmm. However, we did see later that Mazloum Abdi, the SDF commander, did say that he, quote, had a commitment to accelerate the integration of the SDF into the Syrian state. So how at face value should we be reading all these announcements? And have the earlier obstacles to SDF Syrian army integration, in fact, been overcome? I mean, is there a reason why they were all so optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, this is a key question, and I think it's as yet unanswered. We don't yet know. I have to say, when I first heard about plans for President al-Sharaa to visit Washington, and when I first heard that Syria was being persistently invited by the US to join the counter-ISIS coalition, and by the way, this acceptance came after 4 invitations, one of my major concerns was if they took either or both of those steps to visit Washington and to join the coalition, that the SDF would feel even more squeezed in an ever tighter corner and then become less amenable to the negotiations, which frankly is what we've seen over the last 6 months. The more credibility, the more engagement that the Syrian government in Damascus has received, the harder the SDF has been in those negotiations. So the statement by General Mazloum the other day is a potentially encouraging sign. I mean, he said that he had committed to accelerating the integration. So I think the key now is to hold him to his word. The deal on the table between Damascus and the SDF has been on the table. All the details have been on the table for, a bunch of months now. It's not going to change. The deal on the table is supported by the US. It's really just up to the SDF now to accept and then to begin to move forward on implementing some of those first steps of integration.
And to clarify to listeners, we're talking about integrating the units into the military. The sticking point has been, are these joining as individuals? Or are they joining as kind of separate SDF units inside of the Syrian army?
Yes, exactly. And so roughly a couple months ago, it was agreed that, quite surprisingly, I think, it was agreed that the SDF would be given 3 divisions within the Syrian army for its forces to be within, and that they would be predominantly based where they already are now. That was originally an SDF demand that Damascus would not even entertain. And they have now more or less agreed to that.
And Ankara was also.
And Ankara was also against it, exactly. So Turkey, I mean, to give Turkey its credit, given its behavior vis-a-vis the SDF over the years, it's also been remarkably patient. We haven't seen a single Turkish military action in recent months, despite some fairly troubling actions by the SDF at times. So everyone has tried to be patient and give space for these talks to move forward, but they haven't really, frankly, in the last 6 months. And so this is going to be a big test with President al-Sharaa leading the Syrian government into the counter-ISIS coalition. The SDF is squeezed now in a very tight corner. It has very little options other than to integrate. It has been playing, in my assessment at least, it's been playing a waiting game to see if this government was going to slip up, make a huge mistake. And then in that sense, the SDF hadn't dissolved yet, and it still held all the cards that it held before. But I think this meeting in Washington was a game changer. You can't really reverse an Oval Office meeting and a very friendly meeting with President Trump, and certainly not some of the optics coming out of CENTCOM. We've had the video of CENTCOM Commander Brad Cooper playing basketball with President al-Sharaa, and those videos don't get leaked by accident. Those are purposeful optics coming from both sides that this is a relationship that's here to stay. So, yeah, I think all we can say without repeating myself too much is we need to be optimistic. We need to hope those talks move forward. We have to hope nothing else gets in their way. And that once it happens, things will really start to move forward in Syria. 80% of Syria's oil and gas resources are in SDF areas. They are the key to unlocking some real economic recovery. And there is a whole host of oil and gas giants just waiting for the tender to start investing in those facilities. And if and when they do, the economy in Syria has much more of a capacity to start getting back onto its feet. So it's very high stakes for Syria's future.
Wanted to drill down on the economic front in a little bit more detail. Obviously, we touched on it earlier, touched on the fact that while there had been these recent rollbacks of sanctions on Sharaa and other Syrian officials, their delisting and the issuance of a 180-day waiver on the Caesar Act sanctions, that these are not permanent repeals. These are temporary measures, so it's kind of kicking the can down the line a little bit. You met recently with Syria's central bank governor to discuss the host of economic challenges and opportunities facing the country. What were your takeaways from that meeting? What are the sort of most pressing issues on top of his agenda?
Well, the first one, and I hope you won't mind me quoting him, but the first one was there wasn't really a central bank to speak of when he walked into the building. There was a building, but there wasn't a central bank. It wasn't staffed up. There wasn't system and structures. And so I think that, the biggest challenge for him and frankly, many of the ministries has been building from the ground up. And that shouldn't be underestimated, the extent to which that is a challenge by itself. Syria doesn't have the capacity to pay its own salaries at the moment within the public sector. So huge challenges in that respect. Then he faces an inflationary challenge that he's preparing to release a new currency in the start of the new year, and he's likely to chop one or two zeros off the valuation to try to incentivize more business. That's an experimental approach in the finance world, but we'll see if it works. But his key challenge is, as he made very clear to me, there is no shortage. There is pages and pages and pages of lists of all these potential investors. And yet they can't get money into Syria. Yes, the SWIFT transaction system is open, it's not closed. But the Caesar Act predominantly is this steel wall preventing banks from being willing to transact money into and out of Syria. The carpet's been laid out, the investors are waiting, but there's no way to get the money into the country. And so in some ways, it's really quite simple. But the Caesar Act is a noose around Syria's neck right now, unless it's lifted. And yes, we have a second 180-day waiver. But as we discovered with the first one, which was introduced earlier this year, it makes no difference to a bank whether or not you have the Caesar Act, or if a government has basically said, right, we're going to take it away for 180 days, but maybe we might put it back after that. Yeah. In a bank's world, 180 days is like an hour. So great. Thank you, US Department of Treasury and State for putting that in place, but it doesn't change anything. It's up to Congress. And as we know, the Senate has already passed the legislation to push this through. It's up to the House, and we can get into it if you want. But I mean, the concerns being expressed by members of the House are already concerns that were being addressed through the Senate negotiations with the Syrian government. There are already these same expectations that are there from the Trump administration. But the argument that we're not going to allow the Syrian economy to get its feet back on the table until we have seen, for example, the safety and security of minority communities makes no sense. Because if you continue to strangle the Syrian economy, you are putting in place conditions that will unquestionably result in more conflict, more violence, in which minority communities will naturally suffer probably the most. So it's actually just an illogical approach. Use the old, regional saying that Israel uses a lot these days: trust and verify. Well, you got to trust first, and if you can then verify. You can't expect all of the results to come first before giving them a chance to actually move things forward in a better direction.
One of the issues that you mentioned earlier, are kind of one of the areas of discussion in the Sharaa-Trump meeting, was this effort to kind of push U.S. investment in Syria. What do you think the U.S. can do to boost that and to kind of facilitate Syria's broader economic reintegration into the region?
Again, to come back to it, the first one is just to allow investment to happen, which means the sanctions. I mean, that's the first and obvious. That's number 1 to 99 of the list of priorities. Because without that, nothing's going to happen anyway. But then after that, I think, having the vote of confidence from the United States, and quite frankly, having the vote of confidence from a Trump administration, which, puts business and finance at the front of the agenda, but is also not necessarily always known for its kind of, open stance to questionable characters and unstable environments. Having the vote of confidence from Donald Trump and from his administration will mean a lot too. It will give the rest of the world the confidence that Syria is likely to, remain well engaged by the US and the rest of the world, and therefore is a safe place to continue to engage. If Donald Trump was saying, well, we're going to give Ahmed al-Sharaa a go, but we'll see where it goes, you wouldn't see the rush of engagement we're seeing from the rest of the world. It really has been genuinely transformational, the decision by the Trump administration to engage. So I think that helps. And then the US has a convening power, if it wants to try to convene these kind of conversations. And I think if I was to pick out one weakness from the international community's response since Assad's fall, it's been that a lot of the international community's made the right decisions, but they've all made them individually. There's been very little international coordination. Nothing to link the US approach to the European approach to the regional approach, and let alone other actors beyond that. And there will come a time eventually when Syria starts to settle down a bit, and if Caesar is removed, where it will become vital that the international community coordinates its approach more strategically. We're still in that very early phase where everyone's kind of trying to take a grab of certain assets and certain interests for themselves. The UAE is taking ports, the Turks and the Chinese are both thinking about roads and railways and what have you, but none of it's coordinated. And if that continues forever, it will become competition, and not necessarily good competition. And I think the US is one of very few players who could start to, create some kind of a mechanism to facilitate that coordination.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot today. Plenty more we could, but we're running short on time. Do you have any final thoughts? I mean, what's at stake?
I think it's important to bear in mind, and this is something I always say when I'm speaking to governments on Syria, is Syria isn't just coming out of 14 years of war in which half of the country was destroyed and communities turned against each other. It's also coming out of more than half a century of brutal, desperately corrupt, and in many cases inept dictatorship. And for that reason, or those reasons, the country's going to look very far from perfect and probably quite unstable for a long time. So whether you're a casual observer or a policymaker or someone in the business world, do not expect Syria to look clean and perfect anytime soon. It won't. It just won't. And if you think it will, you will always be disappointed. The challenges socially in Syria are gigantic, and it's not a challenge of, jihadis or former jihadis oppressing minorities. there are minority on minority violence. There's inter-minority violence, Alawites on Alawites. There are different Christian denominations taking completely different approaches towards the transition, towards their local communities. The Kurds in the northeast have closed all of the Christian schools in northeastern Syria, but they're all open in the areas previously controlled by jihadists. So Syria is a complicated place, but I think tempering our expectations is really, really important. But the key metric to make sure that things are still heading in the right direction is to look at everything and see, are things moving forward? Even if they're moving forward at 1 mile an hour, we're in a good place, because you cannot understate the enormous challenges that this country faces in terms of being able to get back up onto its feet. So A, that's going to take a long time. But B, whilst it takes a long time, it is not going to look clean and perfect. It isn't. But as long as things are still moving in the right direction, we're in a good place, and we should continue to support that. Because, to close it out, if Syria gets this right, and if we help it get it right, this genuinely could be, and it's not an exaggeration to say, really transformational for the region. Syria is at the heart of the Middle East. For 50 years, Syria has exported little else than threats and instability and bullying foreign policy behavior to its neighbors. And so that therein created this long-term saying, what happens in Syria never stays in Syria. Well, for a long time, that phrase has been associated with bad behavior and bad effects. We could flip that on its head and create it in a positive fashion. All the good things happening in Syria will have positive knock-on effects to the neighbors. Jordan's economy is in dire straits, mostly because of Syria. Lebanon's divided and economically destroyed, in part because of Syria. Turkey's economy is under huge strain because of having to host millions of Syrian refugees. Iraq and its takeover, frankly, by many Iranian militias and interests is in part because those same interests channeled right through Syria all the way to the Mediterranean. If we flip all of that on its head, a lot of the region has a lot to benefit from. And again, the only way to make sure that that works, quite frankly, is that the US has a key to turn here. The US has a lot more leverage on this than I think has traditionally been understood, to make sure that that goes in the right direction.
Charles, thanks again for joining us on the program today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
And a warm thanks also goes out to our listeners for tuning in, as well as to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Syria, please visit our website at www.mei.edu.
You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you listen in again next week.